The gavel struck the bench. The courtroom was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Ethan Calloway rose, his eyes never leaving the judge. He walked slowly towards the evidence table, pulled 2 sheets of paper from his file, and carefully placed them before Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, these are copies of the original mortgage agreement and a modification filed 3 months later." The judge frowned, leaning forward to examine them. Across the aisle, Richard Sterling smirked, his fingers steepled, as if waiting for Ethan to dig his own grave. But Ethan remained composed. "If you look closely at the signatures," he continued, his voice steady, "you'll see something amiss." Sterling shifted slightly. The judge's eyebrows furrowed, his eyes scanning the 2 documents. A flicker of a raised eyebrow. Then he looked up, his gaze sharper. "What do you mean, Mr. Calloway?" Ethan met his eyes. "Your Honor, the second signature is a forgery." Tense silence filled the room. The laughter was gone. Only skepticism remained. Before we delve into this story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another inspiring tale, tailored just for you. They scorned him, dismissed him, and treated him like a fool, until he exposed a legal fraud right before the judge's eyes. The courtroom was against him before he even spoke. Ethan Calloway stepped forward, his suit slightly worn, his tie a bit askew, but his posture firm. He wasn't a lawyer, never claimed to be. He was just a man who wouldn't let his grandmother's house be taken by a corporate machine that saw people as mere numbers on a balance sheet. Judge Grayson peered over his glasses, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smirk, but not far from it. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the gavel lightly on the bench. "Mr. Calloway, representing yourself?" The question dripped with amusement. Ethan looked him straight in the eye. "Yes, Your Honor." A ripple of laughter echoed from across the room. Richard Sterling, the opposing counsel, deliberately adjusted his cufflinks with a leisurely air. A corporate pit bull, with a track record of crushing small-time defendants. Sterling was here to do what he did best, win. And Ethan, well, he wasn't even a challenge. This would be quick. Sterling muttered to his assistant, who offered a knowing smirk. Ethan heard it. He was meant to. That was the point. But he kept his expression neutral. He'd been counted out before. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, underestimated. That's why he was here. The judge sighed, flipping through a file. "This is a property dispute, is it not? A foreclosure challenge?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. My grandmother's house." Grayson barely glanced at him. "And you believe you can argue this case against a seasoned attorney like Mr. Sterling?" Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't believe, Your Honor." "I know." The courtroom fell silent. A few stifled snickers came from the corporate side, but there was something else too, something unspoken. The kind of quiet that falls when an underdog refuses to back down. Judge Grayson shook his head. "Very well. Let's proceed." But Ethan wasn't just here to argue. He was here to win. And they had no idea what was coming. But the judge's skepticism was just the beginning. The real challenge was coming from the man sitting across the aisle, the man who thought Ethan had already lost. Richard Sterling adjusted his tie with a self-satisfied smile. This was his arena, the courtroom, the rules, the strategy. He'd crushed dozens of Ethan Calloways before. A man with no degree, no firm behind him, no experience. This wasn't a case, it was a warm-up. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Sterling, you may begin your opening statement." Sterling rose with practiced ease, buttoning his jacket as he strode toward the jury. His voice was smooth, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is quite simple." He gestured toward Ethan without looking at him. "We have a man who refuses to accept reality. The property in question was legally acquired by my client through foreclosure. The law is clear, the facts are undeniable. This is not about emotions, it's about contracts, deadlines, and obligations. My client followed the law. Mr. Calloway did not." A calculated pause, a slow turn, then a dismissive shrug. "I understand. Losing a home is painful. But pain does not override legal responsibility. The numbers do not lie." He gave a curt nod towards the judge, then sat down, folding his hands as if the case were already closed. Ethan remained seated, unfazed. He'd anticipated this. But as he rose from his chair, he caught the way Judge Grayson leaned back, arms crossed, a man observing something he didn't believe was worth his time. "Your Honor, members of the jury." Ethan cleared his throat, his voice steady. "Mr. Sterling is correct about one thing, the law is clear. The question is, did his client actually follow it?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Sterling's face. Ethan continued. "I've spent the last 6 months researching every case, every statute, every loophole that banks and corporations use to steal homes from families. And I found something." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Something?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, and it changes everything." Sterling let out a dismissive chuckle. "Oh, this should be good." Ethan ignored him. Instead, he turned to the judge. "Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to make a formal request for discovery, as I have reason to believe the plaintiff is withholding evidence." The courtroom buzzed. Judge Grayson sat up straighter, his expression no longer one of amusement. "Withholding what, Mr. Calloway?" Ethan's gaze locked onto Sterling. "Fraud." And just like that, the laughter died. The word fraud hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse. Sterling's smirk vanished, and for the first time, Judge Grayson gave Ethan more than a passing glance. "Fraud?" The judge's voice held a note of skepticism, but beneath it, curiosity. Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe my grandmother's foreclosure was based on fraudulent documents, and I can prove it if I'm allowed to compel full discovery." Sterling exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. A baseless accusation to delay the inevitable. The property was foreclosed on under standard foreclosure procedures." Ethan tilted his head. "Standard?" He took a step forward, his voice steady. "Tell me, Mr. Sterling, how standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house when the original mortgage documents have 2 different signatures for the same person?" The courtroom buzzed, a few whispers rippling through the gallery. Sterling clenched his jaw. "What are you implying?" Ethan rummaged through his folder and pulled out 2 copies of the original mortgage agreement. He walked to the bailiff and handed them to the judge. "These are 2 separate copies of the same document, Your Honor. One from the original filing and one from a later modification. If you look at the signatures, you'll see they don't match." Judge Grayson peered down, examining the papers, his brow furrowed. Ethan continued. "I'm no expert, but I know my grandmother's signature, and that second one isn't hers." The judge flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from dismissive to focused. He looked up at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, do you have an explanation for this?" Sterling cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this is an attempt to confuse. Signatures can change over time." Ethan didn't let up. "Perhaps, but that second signature is from a document filed just 3 months after the original. And if you compare them side by side," he pointed to the papers in the judge's hand, "you'll see that not only do they look completely different, but the second signature was signed the day after my grandmother was admitted to the hospital for a stroke." A wave of reaction washed through the courtroom, even the jury leaning forward. Judge Grayson turned back to Sterling, his voice now edged with steel. Mr. Sterling, does your client possess the original signed documents? Sterling hesitated. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Ethan saw it, and so did the judge. We will need time to retrieve them, Your Honor. Ethan smiled. That's fine, I'll wait. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't just curiosity, it was suspicion. But Ethan wasn't just here to poke holes in their story. He was here to tear it apart piece by piece, and this was just the beginning. Judge Grayson exhaled through his nose, flipping through the documents again, his eyes scanning the mismatched signatures, his fingers tapping on the bench. The judge, who had been so sure of Ethan's incompetence, now looked intrigued. Sterling, however, was trying to regain control. Your Honor, these documents do not change the core of the case. The defendant is grasping at straws, hoping to delay the inevitable. The bank followed the legal process, that's what matters. Ethan let the words hang in the air before speaking. Followed the legal process? He exhaled a small breath, shaking his head. Mr. Sterling, do you know who your client purchased this debt from? Sterling blinked. What does that have to do with anything? Ethan turned to the judge. Your Honor, the mortgage was sold 3 times before it reached the current lender. 3 separate times. But the transfer paperwork. He paused, pulling another document from his folder and handing it to the bailiff. That's where things get interesting. Grayson took the papers, examining them, his jaw tightening. Ethan continued. Each time the loan changed hands, it had to come with an endorsement, a formal transfer from one lender to the next. But take a closer look. Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Grayson's eyebrows furrowed. There's no signature on the final transfer. Ethan nodded. Exactly. Which means the final company had no legal right to foreclose on my grandmother's house, and the bank who did, never actually owned the loan in the first place. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The tension in the air was thick. Sterling sat up straighter, his voice strained. Your Honor, this. Grayson cut him off. This is a problem. Ethan took a slow breath. He had them right where he wanted them. They'd underestimated him, laughed at him, but they weren't laughing now. But exposing the fraud was one thing, proving intent was another, and that's where Ethan was about to hit them hardest. Sterling's face had lost its smugness. The confidence that had radiated from him at the start of the trial was cracking, and Ethan saw it. The man who had treated this case as a formality was now scrambling to regain control. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his voice sharp. Mr. Sterling, I presume your client has an explanation for this mortgage being transferred. Without proper endorsement. Sterling hesitated. Your Honor, I need to consult with my client before making a statement on that. Ethan tilted his head. You mean the same client who filed legally questionable documents in multiple foreclosure cases just like this one? Sterling whipped his head around. That's a preposterous allegation. Ethan didn't blink. Is it because I took the liberty of researching your client's foreclosure history? Turns out, my grandmother's house isn't the only one they acquired under these exact circumstances. Another document, another piece of evidence, was presented to the judge. Judge Grayson scanned the papers, his expression darkening. He exhaled slowly, looking up at Sterling. This case is not as straightforward as you suggested. Sterling's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Ethan stepped forward. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness. Grayson looked at him. A witness? Ethan nodded. Yes, the notary who notarized the second mortgage signature, the one I believe is fraudulent. A small gasp rippled through the gallery. This case wasn't just about missing paperwork anymore. Ethan was about to bring someone into the courtroom who could shed light on the entire scheme. Sterling shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This witness was not previously disclosed. Ethan turned to him, his voice even. That's because I only found her yesterday, and what she told me. He let the silence hang for a beat. Changes everything. Judge Grayson observed him, then turned to Sterling. I'll allow it. Sterling froze. He knew this case was slipping away, but Ethan's biggest move was yet to come. Because the witness wasn't just any notary, she was the one person who could unravel the entire case. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and a woman stepped in. Sarah Myers, a notary, looked tense as she approached the witness stand. She adjusted her glasses, her fingers gripping the railing. Judge Grayson nodded towards her. Please state your full name and occupation for the record. She cleared her throat. Sarah Myers. I'm a licensed notary. Ethan rose, his voice calm but firm. Ms. Myers, do you recall notarizing the second mortgage modification for my grandmother, Eleanor Calloway? Sarah hesitated, glancing at Sterling. I do. Ethan nodded. And were you present when she signed that document? Another pause, a flicker of unease crossing her face. Sterling shifted in his seat. Ethan waited, giving her space. Finally, Sarah exhaled. No, I wasn't. A gasp echoed through the courtroom. Judge Grayson's eyes sharpened. Ethan continued. Ms. Myers, did you witness anyone else signing on her behalf? She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. No. Ethan stepped closer. Then how was that document notarized? Sarah's hand trembled slightly. I was given the paperwork by a bank representative. They told me it was already signed, and I just needed to stamp it. Another wave of shock rippled through the room. She had just admitted to notarizing a signature without proper verification, rendering the entire foreclosure process illegal. Sterling jumped to his feet. Objection. This is hearsay, Your Honor. She can't verify the legitimacy of. Judge Grayson raised a hand, cutting him off. Overruled. His voice had lost all traces of patience. Turning to Sarah, Ms. Myers, do you understand the legal implications of what you've just said? Sarah nodded, her eyes misting over. Yes, Your Honor. I didn't know at the time, but I should have. Sterling sank back into his seat, running a hand over his face. He knew it was over. Ethan turned back to the judge. Your Honor, based on this testimony, the forged signature, and the missing mortgage transfer endorsements, I move to dismiss this foreclosure. My grandmother's house was taken by fraudulent means, and now the evidence is before you. Silence. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, tapping his gavel on the bench. When he spoke, his voice was firm. The court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is dismissed. The property is to be returned immediately. Ethan released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The anticipation, the fight, the endless months of research, all led to this moment. He turned, catching Sterling's empty stare. The man who had dismissed him as nothing was just defeated in front of the entire courtroom. But Ethan wasn't thinking about him anymore. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. His grandmother's house wouldn't be stolen, not today, not ever. But the lesson here wasn't just about winning a case, it was about standing up, even when no one believes you can. Ethan stepped out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows down the steps. He paused, taking a slow breath. The air felt different, not lighter, not freer, just real. The kind of real that settles in when a fight is finally over. His grandmother's house was safe, that's all that mattered. A few people from the gallery trickled out behind him, their voices hushed. Some whispered about the case, others about him. He caught snippets of their words, phrases like, "never saw it coming," and "that man should be a lawyer." But Ethan didn't need the validation. He never had. All he needed was justice, and today, he'd gotten it. A voice called out from behind him, "Calloway." Ethan turned, finding Judge Grayson standing at the top of the courthouse steps, his hands in his pockets. The earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by something more measured. "You surprised me in there." The judge's tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. Ethan met his gaze. "You weren't the only one." Grayson studied him for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Ever thought about going to law school?" Ethan let out a small laugh. "Not really." Grayson's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Just for a second. Might want to reconsider. You have a talent for making people uncomfortable." And with that, he turned and disappeared back into the courthouse. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. Law school? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing was certain, if anyone tried to take what was his again, they'd better be ready for a fight. Because power wasn't just about money and titles, it was about those who refused to back down. And if this case proved anything, it was that the underdogs always had the most to prove, and when given the chance, they don't just win, they change the game. Ethan Walker's story has shown us that, even when underestimated, the power of persistence and courage can change the game. Have you ever faced a situation where you felt overwhelmed, but were determined to stand up for what's right? Share your story in the comments. Your voice can inspire and motivate others facing similar circumstances. If you found this story meaningful, please share it with your friends and family to spread the message of justice and the strength of an unyielding spirit. Thank you for watching and supporting. Let's work together to create positive change, step by step, to build a better society. May you always be strong and successful on your journey to fight for what is right. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe for the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individuals or organizations. They are shared for the purpose of spreading humane values in life and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any errors, please overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.